This is the Acropolis. It's an ancient citadel located at the top of a hill in Athens, Greece. The word Acropolis actually means citadel in Greek, which makes sense given that this was originally an area that was fortified to protect the city from invaders. In fact, people have lived here since the Neolithic Age, around 4000 BC, with settlements continuing to grow up until the Middle Ages. Over time, these settlements would be destroyed and rebuilt. But it was during the Golden Age of Athens in the 5th century BC that the Acropolis became the iconic landmark that we see today. During this period, Athens was a democratic society that dominated the political, military, and cultural landscape of Greece. And because of its location high above the city, the Acropolis became the place where many important public buildings were constructed. But as much as it was a center for political power, it was also a religious one. At the time, the Greeks believed that the gods lived among them, and their lives were controlled by the whims of the divine. So, they built these amazing structures to honor and appease their gods. They hoped that if they made impressive monuments, then the gods would bless them with prosperity and good fortune. And no monument was more impressive than the Parthenon, a temple dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare. Construction began around 447 BC and it took 8 years to complete, making it one of the largest building projects in the ancient world. This temple was huge, spanning nearly 230 feet in length and 100 feet in width. Its frieze alone, which is the decorative molding that runs along the top of the wall, contained over 100 marble slabs, each weighing several tons. But the most impressive aspect of the Parthenon was not its size or its intricate carvings, but its dome. It was a revolutionary architectural achievement, a massive concrete structure that was over 90 feet wide and 38 feet high, all without any internal support columns. It was such a marvel that it stood for centuries, only to be destroyed by an earthquake in the 6th century AD. But the Parthenon wasn't the only attraction at the Acropolis. The entire complex was surrounded by other temples and shrines, including the Erechtheion, which was dedicated to the gods Poseidon and Athena. The most famous feature of the Erechtheion is its Porch of the Maidens, 4 beautiful marble columns that are carved in the shape of young women. But unlike the Parthenon, the Erechtheion never fell into disrepair. Its marble was stripped away by the Venetians in the 16th century, but thankfully it still stands to this day. There was also the Propylaea, which was the main entrance to the Acropolis. It was designed by the famous architect Pericles and featured a grand staircase that led up to a series of colonnades. Visitors could walk through the colonnades and admire the views of Athens below, or they could continue on to the Temple of Athena Nike, a small but elegant temple dedicated to the goddess of victory. But no matter what temple you visited, you couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the beauty of the architecture. Each building was a masterpiece, a harmonious blend of sculpture and geometry that expressed the ideals of classical Greek art. For example, the columns were perfectly straight and tapered. The friezes were meticulously carved, and the statues were idealized representations of the human form. It was this perfection that made the Acropolis so irresistible to the ancient Greeks. They saw the temples as tangible expressions of their culture and values, and they took great pride in them. In fact, the Acropolis was considered the heart and soul of Athens, a place where the citizens could come together and celebrate their identity. It was a source of unity and inspiration, and it was a symbol of their superiority over other cultures. And who can blame them? After all, there was nowhere else in the ancient world that had anything like the Acropolis. It was truly a one-of-a-kind marvel, and it was something that the Athenians cherished above all else. Sadly, though, the Golden Age of Athens didn't last forever. In 431 BC, the Peloponnesian War broke out between Athens and Sparta, and it would ravage Greece for the next 27 years. The war was devastating for both sides, but it was especially brutal for Athens. By the end of the conflict, the city was in ruins. The population had been decimated by disease and famine, and the economy was in sharp decline. And with the city in such bad shape, the Acropolis was neglected. The buildings were damaged, the statues were defaced, and the entire complex was used as a military garrison. But Athens would eventually recover from the war, and the Acropolis would be restored to its former glory. However, this wouldn't last either. In 1456, the Ottoman Empire invaded, and they would rule Greece for the next 400 years. During this time, they converted the Parthenon into a mosque, but it would eventually fall into disrepair once again. Then in the early 1800s, the British diplomat Lord Elgin started removing the remaining marble slabs and shipping them off to London. He claimed that he had permission from the Ottoman authorities, but this is disputed. Either way, today you can find some of the finest examples of ancient Greek art in the British Museum. Thankfully, though, some parts of the Acropolis remain in Athens, including the most important structure of all, the Parthenon. Today it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most popular tourist destinations in the world. Every year, over 5 million people visit the Acropolis to marvel at the ancient Greek architecture and learn about the history of this once great civilization. And as you explore the ruins, you can't help but feel a sense of wonder at what you're seeing. It's hard to believe that these structures are over 2,000 years old. And it's even harder to imagine the glory that they must have possessed in their prime. But thanks to modern technology, you can get a glimpse of what the Acropolis looked like in ancient times. If you use your imagination, you can picture the bustling crowds, the sound of worshippers, the smell of incense burning, and the sight of priests carrying out rituals. You can almost hear the whispers of history echoing around you. And it's a feeling that's hard to match anywhere else. Of course, no trip to the Acropolis would be complete without visiting the Acropolis Museum. This museum was built in 2009 to showcase the thousands of artifacts that have been discovered at the site. It is one of the best museums in the world, and it contains everything from sculptures to pottery to coins. But the highlight is definitely the reconstructed frieze from the Parthenon. As you walk along the slabs, you can admire the intricate carvings of gods, heroes, and mythical creatures. And it gives you a new appreciation for the skill and artistry of the ancient Greeks. But the Acropolis isn't just a place to learn about the past. It's also a living, breathing part of modern Greek culture. Every year on March, the Greek army marches to the Acropolis to commemorate the anniversary of the Greek War of Independence. And during the summer, the Acropolis hosts concerts and other public events. It's a place where the old and the new come together, where ancient traditions are kept alive and where the spirit of democracy continues to thrive. So if you ever have the chance to visit Athens, make sure to go to the Acropolis. It's a place that will inspire you, amaze you, and leave you with memories that will last a lifetime. Just be sure to bring comfortable shoes. There's a lot of walking involved. But the stunning views that greet you at every turn will make it all worthwhile. You can wander through the ruins of the Parthenon, explore the mysterious tunnels beneath the Acropolis Hill, or take a stroll through the charming streets of Propylaea, the neighborhood that sits at the bottom of the hill. No matter what you do, you're sure to have an unforgettable experience, so come and discover the magic of the Acropolis for yourself. The ancient world is full of wonders, from the Great Pyramid of Giza to the Colossus of Rhodes. But there's one ancient structure that stands above the rest in terms of name recognition, and it's this one, the Parthenon. You've probably seen images of it, and maybe even visited if you've been to Athens. But why is the Parthenon the most famous monument of the ancient world? To answer that question, we need to go back to ancient Greece and find out what made this temple so special. Welcome to my channel. Today we are answering another great question of the ancient world. What made the Parthenon the most famous monument on the Acropolis? The story of the Parthenon goes back to the Persian Wars. You see, before the construction of the Parthenon, the Athenian Acropolis was home to several temples, including the first temple dedicated to Athena, whom the Athenians considered their patron deity. However, those temples were destroyed during the Persian invasion of Greece. By the time the dust had settled, Athens was a smoking ruin. But the city was determined to rise again. And in order to motivate themselves and their allies, they decided to do something big, like build a massive new temple dedicated to Athena. But who would design such an important structure? Well, two rival architects, Callicrates and Erechtheion, who both submitted plans for a new temple. But ultimately the project went to a third architect, someone whose name has been lost to history. But that's not to say he didn't leave behind a legacy. The result of his design was the greatest building the Greeks had ever constructed and, by extension, the greatest building the world had ever seen, the Parthenon. Construction began around 447 BC and took 7 years to complete, a relatively quick time for a project of this size. And once completed, the temple stood 230 feet or 70 meters tall and measured 227 feet or 69 meters wide and 490 feet or 150 meters long. This made the Parthenon the largest building in Greece until the Roman Forum was expanded in the 2nd century BC. The reason for the enormous size was also an enormous treasury. In fact, it was thanks to the Delian League that the Parthenon was able to be built. You see, after the Persian Wars, the Greek city-states formed a sort of NATO called the Delian League, which collected funds from its members in order to protect Greece from any future Persian invasions. Originally, the treasury of the Delian League was kept on the island of Delos, but as the league grew and more money poured in, the treasury needed to be moved to Athens, and that's where the money went, to building the greatest temple the world had ever seen. But the Parthenon wasn't just huge, it was beautiful too. Built in the Doric order, the temple featured 92 columns with intricate carvings on each one. The metopes, or the square panels between the columns, featured over 100 life-size sculptures depicting battles between gods and monsters, while the frieze depicted scenes from Greek mythology. In total, the sculptures of the Parthenon numbered in the high hundreds, making this one temple a sort of open-air museum showcasing the best sculptures Greece had to offer. But the sculpture that everyone wanted to see was hidden inside the temple behind the altar. It was a massive statue of Athena Parthenos, or the Virgin, crafted by the great sculptor Phidias. The statue was at least 30 feet or 9 meters tall and entirely made of gold and ivory, a fitting tribute to the goddess of wisdom and war. While the statue is long gone, we have a rough idea of what she looked like thanks to a Roman copy of the original, which is located in the British Museum. The interior of the temple was no less impressive. Inside, the walls were covered in paintings showing the genealogy of the gods, while the ceiling was decorated with intricate patterns. In short, the Parthenon was an architectural marvel, a showcase of the greatest artists in Greece, and a source of great pride for the Athenians. So it is easy to see why the poet Simonides described it as the surpassing wonder of the world. But as grand as the Parthenon was, it wasn't without controversy. You see, the construction of the temple was funded by the Delian League, an organization supposedly dedicated to protecting Greece from the Persians. But more and more, Athens was using the League's money for its own projects instead. When the other Greek city-states realized what was happening, they tried to get Athens to return the money, but they refused. Eventually, the other city-states left the alliance and formed their own alliance, which resulted in the Peloponnesian War, which pitted Athens and its allies against Sparta and its allies. Ironically, though, the war was the best thing that could have happened for the Parthenon because it brought Athens into contact with the greatest minds of the age, like the historian Thucydides, the playwright Sophocles, and the sculptor Phidias, who was hired to create a massive statue of Athena for the temple. For about 80 years, the Parthenon stood as a symbol of Athens' power and wealth until the Roman general Sulla sacked the city in 86 BC. The Romans loved Greece and its culture, and most of the spoils of the city went to Rome. A lot of those spoils ended up in the atrium of Sulla's house. Later, Julius Caesar acquired many of these sculptures for his own house, while others ended up in the Temple of Venus Genetrix. But eventually, the booty of Athens found its way into the collections of European royalty. The British royal family acquired the eastern half of the frieze, while the French royal family got the western half. Today, most of the sculptures are still there, but some can be seen in the British Museum. In the meantime, the Parthenon continued to serve as a church until the 1680s, when the building suffered a devastating fire caused by a cannonball from the Ottoman artillery. Although the building was repaired, it never looked the same again. Much of the ornamentation was lost and the roof caved in. In 1816, Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, convinced the Ottomans to sell him part of the building. He then shipped the marbles to England where they were reconstructed in the British Museum. The building was further damaged in 1912 by an earthquake and again in 1930 by a series of powerful earthquakes. Today, only a few scattered columns remain standing and the rest of the structure is nothing but a crumbling heap of marble. So what made the Parthenon the most famous monument of the ancient world? The answer is simple: propaganda. The Athenians purposely set out to make the Parthenon the greatest building the world had ever seen in order to attract the attention of the entire Greek world. They wanted everyone to know how glorious and powerful the city of Athens was. And that's exactly what they did. Poets, historians, and playwrights spread the fame of the Parthenon throughout the Mediterranean. And that fame has never faded. Even today, the name Parthenon is known across the globe. People from every corner of the earth have heard of the great Temple of Athena. And when you consider everything it had to offer, it's easy to see why. I hope you enjoyed learning what made the Parthenon the most famous monument on the Acropolis. If you did, please follow my channel. Thanks for watching. What if I told you that this war right here in this very spot may have been the most important event in the history of Western civilization? Seriously, consider this for a moment. If Athens didn't win this war, well, Western civilization might not exist. That's because after the Persian Empire's defeat at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, Athens used the tribute from their newly enslaved empire to fund the construction of the Parthenon, which is generally considered to be the world's first true democracy. But it doesn't stop there. The gold that poured into Athens also brought an unprecedented age of cultural achievement known as the Golden Age of Athens, which would produce great philosophers like Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, as well as playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. In fact, during the next century and a half, no less than 17 Athenian leaders and 34 actors would win multiple awards at the City Dionysia Theatre Festival, with the latter being a record that has never been broken to this day. But today, only the ruins remain. So how did Athens go from looking like this to looking like this to looking like this? Well, that's what we're gonna find out today by exploring what life was like in Athens before, during and after the Persian Wars. But first, if you're enjoying this video so far, then hit that subscribe button. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Athens went from being a small city-state to being the cultural capital of the ancient Greek world. And it all started when this Persian prince named Darius invaded Greece in 500 BC due to the Ionian Greeks revolting against Persian rule. Now, Athens had been neutral up until this point, but after sending some ships to help the Spartans put down a revolt in Thera, they got pulled into the conflict. After all, Athens was a maritime power whose empire stretched throughout the Aegean Sea, while Persia controlled the coast of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. So naturally, both sides wanted the other one to stay out of their respective spheres of influence. But since Athens couldn't reasonably expect to win a war against the largest empire in the ancient world, they opted to side with the Spartans, whom they had a strong alliance with. And so just 2 years later in 492 BC, the Persians retaliated by invading the islands of Euboea and Attica. This caused the Athenians to flee into the city, which they heavily fortified, preparing to make a stand. Now, you might be wondering why the Athenians didn't try to fight the Persians outside of the city. And that's because the Persian king had already burned down the long walls that connected Athens to its harbor at Pericles, forcing the Athenians to hunker down and hope for the best. Then in 490 BC, the Persian king's brother, who was trying to conquer the rest of Greece, finally arrived with a massive army that camped out near the plain of Marathon. Today, exactly where this army camped is unknown. But according to Plutarch, the Persian king boasted that his army was so large that they could produce 200 pairs of identical twins from every tribe in Athens. But despite being outnumbered to 2-1, the Athenian general Midiatus led a surprise attack on the center of the Persian army, routing them and causing them to flee. Although Marathon was not the bloodiest battle in history and it didn't take place in Athens itself, it was still a huge deal because it stopped the Persian invasion of Greece. In fact, it was so big that according to legend, an Athenian named Pheidippides ran the 26 miles back to Athens to announce their victory, then collapsed and died. Now, because of this victory, Athens' power would grow significantly as more city-states began joining their alliance, which meant more trade and more money. And the first thing that they decided to do was rebuild the long walls. But while the walls were being rebuilt over the next 10 years, the Persians would attempt to more invasions of Athens. And each time the Athenians would successfully defend their homeland. For instance, when 6,000 Persian soldiers landed in Attica in 482 BC, the Athenians would beat them at the Battle of the Arginus River. And then when the Persian king Xerxes invaded Attica 4 years later with an even larger force, the Athenians would team up with the Spartans and the Thebans to form the second largest army that Greek had ever seen, which would lead to one of the most iconic battles in history at Thermopylae. Now, the Spartans may have lost that battle, but thanks to a traitor named Ephialtes, the Greek fleet defeated Xerxes' navy at the Battle of Salamis. And then 2 years later, the Greeks chased Xerxes' retreating army all the way back to Persia, winning a decisive victory at the Battle of Plataea in 446 BC. So now that the Persian wars were officially over, Athens would finally begin to enter what is known as the Golden Age of Athens, which lasted for roughly the next 150 years. During this period, Athens would become the dominant power in Greece, reigning supreme over an empire of 300 to 400 subject states, depending on the source. And this imperialistic foreign policy, coupled with aggressive commercial expansion, produced staggering wealth for the city-state. And so now that the Athenians had lots of extra money, they began undertaking massive building projects to make their city more beautiful. For instance, around 447 BC, Pericles, who was the leading statesman of Athens during this era, decided to refurbish and expand the Acropolis. For those of you who don't know, the Acropolis was a natural citadel, meaning it was a fortified area within the city of Athens that was surrounded by steep cliffs. And since the Acropolis had been fortified even before it was part of a unified Athens, it was initially comprised of several separate buildings dedicated to different gods and goddesses, such as the citadels of the Erechtheion, which housed a sacred olive tree said to have grown from Athena's tears of joy after she won the contest to become the patron deity of Athens. But then after Pericles took power, he wanted to build a massive temple on top of the Acropolis to serve as a symbol of Athenian greatness. And so in 448 BC, construction began on the most famous structure in the ancient world, the Parthenon. And after 9 years of construction, it was completed in 432 BC, which means that it was around the same age as the Great Pyramid of Giza. In fact, the Parthenon would actually be older than the majority of the structures found at the Acropolis today. That's because in 1687 AD, a Venetian bomb accidentally set fire to the building, completely destroying it. And then 200 years later, Lord Elgin removed many of the remaining sculptures and shipped them off to Britain, where they can mostly be found at the British Museum today. But regardless of what remains at the Acropolis or what has been removed, it is hard to argue that any building in history has had a greater impact on architecture than the Parthenon. That's because centuries later, Roman architects would copy the design of the Parthenon to create their own temples. And then hundreds of years after that, Renaissance architects would copy the Romans to create their own temples, which then inspired neoclassical architecture in the 18th century and beyond. But the Parthenon was not the only impressive structure constructed during the Golden Age of Athens. For instance, a few years after the Parthenon was completed, the Athenians built a new law court, which was the largest building in the ancient world, as well as a series of magnificent temples at the southern end of the Acropolis called the Propylaea, which served as the entrance to the citadel. They also built theaters made entirely of stone, such as the Theater of Dionysus, which could hold 17,000 spectators and featured elaborate scenes carved into the hillside. Not to mention the Stoa of Attalos, a massive colonnaded porch that ran along the south side of the Acropolis that served as a marketplace where vendors could sell their goods and citizens could gather together. In fact, during the Golden Age of Athens, the Athenians were so wealthy that they built libraries, one of the earliest being the Library of the Egyptian Goddess of Wisdom, which housed 200 volumes and may have been the first building to have been built specifically as a library. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses during this time, because although Athens enjoyed extraordinary cultural and political achievements, serious problems were brewing beneath the surface. And we'll explore those problems in part 2 of this series, which I will hopefully release next week. Thanks for watching.